I'm Catherine Ellis, 36 years old, and I still remember the chill in my hands as I stared at the screen that morning. My family's message glowed back at me. Terse, final, impossible to take back the people I'd supported for years, had just told me I wasn't welcome where I'd given so much. 3 months earlier, I'd handed over most of my savings to help make my brother's dream wedding possible. Now my name was nowhere to be found, and the silence in my apartment felt colder than winter outside. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever wondered how family can turn distant when you least expect it, I grew up in a working-class neighborhood just outside Flint, Michigan, where folks stuck together out of necessity and pride. My parents, Richard and Joyce, gave everything they had to keep the lights on, meals on the table, and hope in our house. My dad spent nearly 3 decades on the line at the plant, while my mom picked up double shifts at the local hospital. Holidays were simple, full of casseroles and laughter. And my younger brother Brian was always at my side, trading secrets and daring me to race him through the snow. We were a team, he and I, even after I left for college, and he still called me every Sunday just to hear about my week. I'd worked my way through school scholarships and late nights determined to give our families something better. When Brian met Lindsay Parker at a mutual friend's barbecue, he sounded like he'd caught his breath after a long run. He talked about her every chance he got, the kind of joy that bubbled over. Without warning, she had auburn hair that caught the sunlight and a way of making people feel seen, at least in the beginning. The first time I met Lindsay, she brought homemade lemon bars to our family picnic and helped my mother with the dishes. Afterward, it felt like maybe I'd finally have the sister I'd always wanted, another woman at the table who understood where we came from. As the months rolled by, their engagement became the center of every conversation, and I found myself smiling through each new story about venues, menus, and dress appointments. I told myself that's what sisters do. Listen, cheer support. Looking back, there were early hints of something shifting, but I missed them at first. I'd fly home for holidays, eager to share news of my job or new friends in Chicago, but somehow the stories always looped back to Lindsay's plans for the wedding. I offered ideas and even a florist I knew from a corporate event, but Lindsay would smile and say she already had someone in mind. Then decisions started happening without me. Family chats moved to new group threads, and I'd learn about changes from a photo someone posted, not from the voices I'd grown up with. Still, I wanted to be part of it all when Brian and Lindsay fell in love with a new venue, a sprawling mansion by the water. I saw the hope in my brother's eyes and the weight on my parents' faces. Money was tight, and there wasn't enough for something so grand. I spent a sleepless night staring at my bank statements, doing the math on what it would mean to give up the nest egg I'd built for my own future. But Brian had always stood up for me, and I wanted to do the same for him. By the next morning, I decided I would help make their dream come true. I called my brother before work, told him the money was his, and he could have the wedding. He and Lindsay wanted. His gratitude was overwhelming promises that I would be the guest of honor, that none of this could happen without me that day. I walked to the bank and signed away $25,000 with my hands shaking, but my heart full of hope. I thought families repaid love with love. What I didn't know then was that sometimes giving everything you have is just the beginning of losing everything you thought you'd built. It started slowly, so quietly, I almost didn't notice. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, little moments at the edge of family conversations. A look exchanged a suggestion that slipped past without response. The first wedding planning meeting brought me to Lindsay's apartment on a drizzly Saturday. She had organized everything down to the smallest detail, from swatches of burgundy fabric to trays of pastries from the local bakery. Her mother, Ellen, had arrived early, bustling around the kitchen with an energy I admired. When I walked in, I handed Lindsay a folder of centerpiece ideas, and she smiled, though it faded almost instantly. "That's thoughtful, Catherine," she said, tucking the folder into a growing stack. "But I think we've already settled on roses and gold accents. You know, simple is sometimes best." I nodded, folding my hands together, watching as the rest of the room circled around her choices. My mother Joyce offered her thoughts about the table settings. Ellen gushed over the signature cocktail Lindsay had selected. Brian, my brother, sat quietly at the counter, mostly nodding along. I kept looking for an opening to contribute, but the conversation always shifted away from me. It was like trying to join a circle where the space kept closing. When I finally mentioned the florist, I knew a friend who'd done incredible work at my company's holiday party. Lindsay offered a polite, tight smile. "That's sweet, but I've already talked to someone who specializes in that exact look." The conversation moved on before I could reply. It was only the first in a series of small, stinging exclusions. The next planning session was set for Tuesday afternoon during my work hours. I texted the group explaining that I couldn't attend because of a client meeting. Lindsay replied, "No worries, we'll catch you up." But no one ever did. Days later, I learned from a Facebook post that the wedding colors had changed. It was a surprise, but not one I felt comfortable questioning. My father, Richard, had always been the voice of encouragement growing up. But as these planning sessions unfolded, he started deferring to Lindsay's opinions. "She really has a vision for this," he'd say whenever I asked about a decision. My mother, too, seemed almost relieved to let someone else take the lead. I told myself this was just part of the process, that every family finds new rhythms as it grows. Still, the gap widened. My suggestions landed softly, never echoing. Once at a family dinner, I brought up a seating chart idea to keep two feuding cousins apart. Lindsay listened, then set her fork down and said, "I think we'll keep things as they are, but thanks for the thought." My parents both nodded as if nothing more needed to be said. The months passed, and I kept trying to find my place. I drove 3 hours home one Saturday for what I thought was a big planning session, only to find Lindsay had forgotten to tell me it was rescheduled. She apologized, but her eyes darted to the clock, eager to move on. "Why don't you stay for dinner? No wedding talk, just family." I sat at the table, the presentation board I'd brought propped against my chair untouched. Each new decision came with a new surprise. The band I'd heard Brian talking about was replaced by a DJ. The cake Lindsay had been so excited about became a modern design I hadn't even seen. I watched these changes from the outside, piecing things together, from phone calls and photos, never from invitations to participate. I tried to talk to Brian alone to ask if he noticed the way things were shifting. He shrugged, glancing at the door as if expecting Lindsay to appear at any second. "You're being too sensitive, Katie," he said, not unkindly, just tired. "It's a lot of stress. Lindsay just wants everything perfect." I sat across from him, the distance between us wider than it had ever been. A few days later, I met Lauren for lunch. She listened quietly as I described what had been happening, letting me spill the words I'd been holding in. "They took your money, and now they're pushing you aside," she said gently. I shook my head. "It's not that simple. Families change." But her words lingered long after I drove home. When the bridal shower came, I arrived early, hoping to help. Ellen and the bridesmaids were already there, arranging everything according to a plan I hadn't seen. Each guest wore a corsage pinned to their blouse except me. During the toasts, Ellen stood and thanked everyone who had made Lindsay's day possible. She didn't mention my name. I watched Lindsay open gifts. Each one met with laughter and applause, and I sat there feeling smaller with every minute. That night as I drove home, the truth began to settle in. My role had changed, and I couldn't find my way back. The little things, the missed invitations, the cold silences had become something much bigger. I tried to talk myself out of it, but the evidence was everywhere. I wasn't being included, not really, not in the way I always had been. The next week, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a birthday gift for my father. A stack of envelopes sat on the kitchen counter, each one addressed in Lindsay's neat handwriting. I picked one up, curious about the final design. My mother walked in, coffee in hand, and smiled. "Those just arrived." "Beautiful, aren't they?" I opened the invitation, my eyes scanning for my name for any mention of my role. I wasn't listed in the wedding party. I looked up and my mother avoided my gaze, focusing on stirring her coffee. "Lindsay thought it would be less stressful if you could just enjoy the day as a guest." My heart sank. "Did Brian know about this?" She nodded, quiet. "He did. He thought you'd be okay with it." I left the house feeling invisible. I drove straight to Brian's apartment, the invitation clutched in my hand. When he opened the door, I asked him outright why I wasn't in the wedding party. He hesitated, looking past me into the hallway. "It's just... things changed. Lindsay wanted a smaller party, and her friends already got their dresses. I thought it'd be simpler this way." I stared at him, searching for the brother I'd always known. I reminded him of what he'd promised, that I would be part of everything, that the day wouldn't happen without me. He looked away and I heard something new in his voice, doubt or maybe regret. "You're still important to us," he said, but the words felt thin. I called my parents that night, hoping they'd help me understand. My father's voice was stern, something I'd rarely heard. "It's their wedding, Catherine. They make the decisions, not us." My mother added, "Lindsay feels you've been critical of her choices. She said you told people she's marrying Brian for the wrong reasons, that you don't like her style." My hands shook. "I never said any of that. Who told you I did?" My mother hesitated. "Lindsay showed us texts." My voice rose, but I tried to stay calm. "I never sent any texts like that." Silence hung between us. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding," my mother said softly, but she sounded far away. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the invitation still unopened beside me. I replayed every conversation, every moment, when I could have said something wrong, every time I tried to help. I wondered when things had changed so completely. I wrote an email to my family, carefully explaining that I loved them, that I only wanted to help, that I'd never said anything hurtful about Lindsay. I apologized if I'd overstepped or made anyone uncomfortable. I asked if we could talk, try to understand each other, find our way back. Their replies came days later. My mother hoped we could move past the unpleasantness. My father suggested I take some time to reflect. Brian said, "I think it's best if we all take some space." As I read those words, I realized just how far I had drifted from the people I once trusted most. The ache was sharper because it came in so many small, quiet moments, missed messages, ignored calls, the way my family's laughter now felt like it belonged to someone else. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. I bought a gift for Brian, something meaningful, hoping it might reach him when words couldn't. I wrapped it, wrote a note, and left it where he'd find it. As the wedding drew closer, I tried one more time to connect, texting the family group to ask when I should arrive for pre-ceremony photos. 20 minutes later, my mother replied, "You're not invited. Lindsay doesn't want you there." The words were so cold, so final, that I read them twice before I could believe they were real. I called everyone, left messages, hoping it was a mistake. No one answered. The silence said more than words ever could. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, Michael walked in. I handed him my phone, unable to speak. He read the message, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. I finally let myself cry, tears that came in waves. The pain of being left out after everything I'd done settled into a heavy, steady ache. I didn't know what would come next, only that the world I'd known had changed. And as the sun set on that day, I realized I was no longer just losing a wedding. I was losing my place in my own family. That first night after my family's message, I couldn't bring myself to turn out the lights. I sat at the kitchen table, my phone face down, the silence of my apartment so deep it felt like an ache in my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother as a boy, barefoot, and laughing in the Michigan summer, the two of us thick as thieves. I wondered how that bond could vanish so quickly. The sting of being left out was sharp, but the deeper hurt came from the stories being told about me, stories I didn't recognize, told by people I'd trusted most. In the days that followed, I drifted through work in a daze. I'd stare at spreadsheets, numbers blurring before my eyes, unable to remember the last thing I'd typed. My manager, Carol, asked if everything was all right. I nodded, forcing a smile I barely felt. Even Michael's gentle concern seemed distant, like a warm blanket I couldn't quite reach. He tried to draw me out, inviting me to share dinner, suggesting a movie, but most nights I just sat in silence watching shadows move across the wall. At first I thought maybe I just needed time. Maybe my family would call or my brother would text with an explanation, but the phone never rang. Not a word came, not even from my parents. The only messages I received were short, polite replies that sounded like they'd been written by strangers. When I scrolled through social media, I saw pictures of my family out for dinner, smiles bright and arms around each other. I wasn't tagged in a single post. The isolation pressed in until I stopped reaching out. I began turning down invitations from friends, worried I'd break down if anyone asked about the wedding. I didn't want to explain the truth that after years of helping and giving, I had been quietly erased. Even small comforts faded. Food lost its taste, and sleep became something I chased without ever catching. I'd wake before dawn with a racing heart, unable to remember what I'd dreamed, but feeling sure I was missing something precious. Lauren checked on me one Saturday, showing up at my door with a bag of groceries and a determined look. She made coffee and coaxed me to eat a slice of toast sitting across from me until the silence broke. When I finally spoke, the words tumbled out. My confusion, my hurt, the feeling that I was drifting out of sight. Lauren listened without judgment, just nodding, her eyes kind. "You're not crazy, Catherine," she said softly. "Sometimes people let their own fears guide them. That's not your fault." After she left, I tried to focus on the parts of my life I could control. I kept my routines: morning walks before work, a call with Michael in the evenings, a book by my bedside. But even these small habits felt hollow, the joy I used to find in them dulled by the heaviness in my chest. As the wedding day crept closer, the loneliness grew heavier. I thought about sending another message, maybe just to my father, hoping he'd remember the daughter who used to sit beside him on the back porch watching the stars. But each time I opened my phone, the words wouldn't come. I was afraid of another cold reply, another reminder of how far I'd fallen from their lives. On the day Brian and Lindsay married, I packed a small overnight bag and drove with Michael to a quiet lake just outside the city. We rented a tiny cabin with worn floorboards and mismatched chairs. The stillness of the water and the distant call of loons gave me room to breathe, to sit with my grief without pretending I was all right. I didn't check my phone once. I didn't want to see photos or hear well-meaning messages from extended relatives who didn't know what had happened. The morning after the wedding, I woke before sunrise. Michael was still sleeping, so I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the world washed in pale pink light. I sat on the steps, hands curled around a mug of coffee, and let myself remember what I'd lost. Not just the wedding, but the simple certainty that my family would always have a place for me. That kind of loss is quiet, more ache than wound, but it lingers in the bones. When we returned home, I found myself moving through the days in slow motion. My mind replayed old arguments and unfinished conversations. I thought about how I'd tried to help, the money I'd given, the hours spent planning, the hope that kindness might be enough. I tried to remember if I'd missed some warning sign, some moment I could have changed the outcome, if I'd only noticed. A week later, a message from Lauren appeared on my phone. She'd run into one of my childhood friends, Denise, who'd just heard about my meltdown during the wedding planning. The story, it seemed, had traveled. Lindsay had told people I'd tried to control everything, that I'd threatened to take back my gift unless I got my way. Hearing it secondhand made the betrayal sink even deeper. The news spread through our hometown faster than I could respond. Old neighbors and distant cousins stopped replying to my texts. Some sent short notes wishing me well, but most said nothing at all. The story wasn't just about exclusion anymore. It was about reputation, about losing the way people had seen me all my life. One night, unable to sleep, I called Diane, my aunt, on my father's side. She lived in Arizona, far from the day-to-day family noise, but we'd always been close. She listened quietly as I shared what had happened, her voice steady and unwavering. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," she said after I'd finished, "but sometimes people choose the path of least resistance. You deserve more than that, Catherine." Talking with Diane brought a measure of comfort. For the first time, I felt seen, like my pain was real, not just something I'd imagined. She promised to reach out to my parents, though she wasn't sure what good it would do. "You can't force people to see what they refuse to look at," she said. At work, my struggle became harder to hide. Carol called me into her office one afternoon and closed the door behind us. She didn't ask for details. She just said, "Take care of yourself. We value you here, but you're allowed to have hard days." She gave me space to work from home and offered support if I needed it. Her kindness chipped away at my isolation, reminding me that not all connections vanish when one relationship fails. As the weeks passed, I tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I cooked simple meals, tried to sleep regular hours, and took walks around the neighborhood. Michael encouraged me to join him on small outings, a movie, a walk in the park, dinner with friends, but I often felt like an observer, not a participant. The laughter around me felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. I kept thinking about the photo frame I'd left for Brian. I wondered if he opened it if he remembered our childhood motto engraved inside. Siblings by chance, friends by choice. I hoped he'd look at that picture and feel something, even if it was only regret. One gray afternoon, as rain streaked the windows, I realized that waiting for my family to reach out was only deepening my pain. I couldn't keep putting my hope in people who had chosen to let me go. I needed to find a way forward, even if it meant leaving that part of my life behind. The realization wasn't a dramatic moment. No angry tears, no slammed doors, just a quiet acceptance, a letting go of something I couldn't hold on to anymore. That night I sat with Michael on the couch, the television flickering in the background. I let myself lean into his presence, feeling the steadiness of his hand in mine. I didn't have the words yet for what I needed, but I knew the first step was to stop reaching for people who had already let go. I would start with small things, honoring the connections I still had, letting myself grieve what was lost, and looking for the quiet places where peace might grow again. Spring arrived, but inside my apartment, it felt like winter never left. I moved through the weeks after the wedding in slow motion. Work was quieter. Michael's warmth was constant, but the ache I carried made it hard to let even him all the way in. Sometimes I would stand by the window at night, listening to the city's distant hum, wishing for one more childhood morning, when Brian and I would eat cold cereal on the porch and laugh about nothing at all. I tried to avoid social media, but one afternoon the algorithm decided for me. The first photo caught my eye before I realized what I was seeing: my parents beaming beside Brian and Lindsay, framed by the glowing lights of that grand wedding venue. My money had made it possible, yet there was no trace of me in any caption or picture. Scrolling felt like pressing on a bruise, each new post, another reminder that I'd been replaced in the family story. I set my phone down and stared out the window. The ache wasn't just about being excluded. It was about realizing that the people I trusted most could believe things about me that weren't true and never even ask for my side. At first I wondered if I could just let it go, but every quiet evening proved otherwise. Grief like this doesn't vanish. It lingers in unexpected places, in the half-folded laundry, in the empty Sunday afternoons that used to belong to family calls. One evening, I received a call from Diane. Her voice was steady, a thread tying me to some version of home. "Catherine, I spoke with your father," she said. "He sounded different. Closed off." She paused. "I don't know if anything I say will reach them, but you need to know you aren't alone in this." We talked for over an hour. I told her things I'd been holding back, the ways the silence had chipped away at my confidence, the shame of being painted as difficult or ungrateful. She listened, never hurrying me, never offering empty comfort. The next day at work, Carol caught me in the hallway. "How are you really doing?" she asked, her hand light on my arm. The question nearly undid me. I managed a shaky laugh, then admitted, "Not great." Carol nodded and told me to take the afternoon for myself. I walked down to the lake, letting the wind clear my head. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe what happened wasn't just sad, it was wrong. Maybe I didn't deserve to carry all this blame. That thought returned later in my therapist's office. Dr. Harris listened as I tried to sort through my guilt, my anger, and the constant wondering if I could have changed the outcome. She didn't rush me, just let the silence stretch until I found words. "You're grieving a family that isn't coming back," she said gently. "You get to feel that loss. You also get to rebuild." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. The room felt lighter, and for a moment I felt the possibility of healing begin to flicker. Back at home, Michael made dinner. He set the table with my favorite mug, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and asked if I wanted to take a walk after. We wandered through our neighborhood dusk, softening the edges of the day. "I know you miss them," he said quietly, "but I hope you know how much I admire your strength." The words stayed with me. That night, as I journaled, I wrote them down not as a declaration, but as a hope I might one day believe. Lauren reached out the following weekend. She invited me to an art show, something small and local. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I could face old friends who might have heard the stories, but Lauren wouldn't take no for an answer. She stood by my side the whole night, introducing me to friends who didn't ask about my family, who only wanted to share a laugh or talk about the paintings. The world hadn't ended. There was still kindness, still beauty, even in the wake of heartbreak. Slowly, I started reclaiming little corners of my life. I swapped family photos for art that made me smile. I changed my Sunday routine, walking to the bakery for a coffee and croissant, jotting down reflections in a small blue notebook. Some days the loneliness pressed in, but other days I found myself breathing a little easier. I was still grieving, but now there was a tiny thread of hope winding through the sorrow. One morning, as I stepped out to get the mail, my neighbor Denise waved from her stoop. She'd always been kind, quick with a smile or a batch of banana bread. We chatted for a while, just small talk about the weather and her roses, but when I went back inside, I realized how much I'd missed those easy, everyday connections. The world was still turning, no matter how stuck I felt. Later that month, Diane called with a quiet urgency in her voice. "Catherine, I think you need to hear this," she said. Lindsay did something similar with one of Brian's friends before. She convinced Brian to let go of people who saw through her. Diane's words fell into place, filling in the cracks of my confusion. Maybe there was never anything I could have done to change it. Maybe this wasn't my failure at all. That night, I let myself cry, not just for the loss, but for the relief of finally understanding I couldn't fix what was never truly mine to fix. When I dried my eyes, I felt lighter. I stood in the kitchen, the city lights bright outside my window, and let myself imagine a future where I wasn't always looking back. I didn't have to be defined by the pain or by the stories others told about me. I could start over one small decision at a time. The next morning, I sat with Michael at breakfast, the sunlight slanting through the window. "I don't know who I am without them," I admitted. Michael reached for my hand. "You're still Catherine. You're resilient and you're loved. And whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone." His words steadied me. I thought about all the ways I'd given to my family, all the ways I'd tried to hold us together, and realized I could begin to direct that same care toward myself. There was no sudden change, no clear line between the old pain and new possibility. But in those small, gentle moments, in the laughter of a friend, in the touch of Michael's hand, in Diane's unwavering support, I began to see the first outlines of a life rebuilt. The path ahead was uncertain, but it belonged to me now. As spring deepened and the city bloomed outside my window, I knew the next steps would be hard. But I was ready, if only to find out who I could become now that the shadows of the past were finally beginning to fade. It was late spring when I decided something needed to change. The sadness hadn't gone away, but it had shifted. It no longer weighed on me like a heavy blanket. Instead, it was sharper now, a reminder each morning that I was still here, still moving forward whether my family noticed or not. I knew I couldn't go back to how things were, but I could stop letting their choices define every part of my day. My first act was small, almost hesitant. I turned off notifications for my family group chat. I wasn't ready to leave it altogether, but I didn't want every ping to be a new reminder of my absence from their lives. Then I went through my social media accounts, unfollowing a handful of distant relatives who had either believed the stories or never bothered to reach out. Each click felt like pruning a branch that had long since withered. At work, I let myself become a little more present. I started eating lunch in the break room again, sometimes joining Carol and Lauren for short walks outside. The trees were full and green, the sidewalks warm beneath our feet. We talked about nothing heavy, just the price of gas, the best new place for ice cream, small talk that made the office feel a little more like a community. These moments of connection didn't erase what I'd lost, but they helped fill the emptiness with something gentle. On weekends, I set new rituals for myself. I visited a small coffee shop I'd always passed but never entered. The owner, a cheerful woman named Nancy, remembered my order after just 2 visits. "Hazelnut latte and a blueberry scone," she'd ask, and the kindness in her voice made me feel visible again. I brought a notebook and wrote down my thoughts, sometimes just a single line, sometimes whole pages. One Saturday, Lauren convinced me to join her for a day trip out to the countryside. We drove with the windows down, music playing low, passing fields just starting to bloom. We didn't talk much about the past. Instead, we wandered through a farmer's market and sat in the shade eating fresh strawberries. I caught myself laughing at something she said, and for the first time in months, it sounded like my own voice. Therapy sessions with Dr. Harris continued, and she encouraged me to set gentle boundaries. It's not about shutting people out, she told me. It's about deciding who has the right to be close. We talked about the idea of family, not just the one you're born with, but the one you build through trust, kindness, and shared experiences. Those words sank in slowly, but they took root. As the weeks passed, I felt less compelled to check on my family. I still missed them, especially Brian, but I accepted that the healing I needed wouldn't come from their approval or their apologies. Instead, I focused on the friendships and routines that brought me comfort. Michael remained steadfast, encouraging my small steps and celebrating every little victory, even if it was just making dinner or going for a walk. In early June, Diane called again. She'd spoken to a few other relatives, people who had heard pieces of Lindsay's story but didn't believe it entirely. Some had reached out to her wanting to know if I was all right. "They miss you, Catherine," Diane said. "They just don't know how to say it." I didn't know how to respond. I was grateful for the care, but also wary. I'd been burned before, and the thought of opening myself up to more pain made me hesitate. One morning as I watered the small row of herbs growing on my windowsill, I realized how much my world had shifted. The family I had known, the one that felt like a solid foundation, was gone at least for now. In its place was something quieter, but also more honest. There was sadness, yes, but also an emerging sense of agency. I could choose what to carry forward and what to let go. That day, I sat down with my journal and wrote out what I wanted my life to look like. I listed the things I still valued: integrity, kindness, laughter, and the people who showed me those qualities every day. The list was shorter than it once would have been, but it felt more real. I wasn't defined by my family's choices anymore. As the summer days grew longer, I started reconnecting with people from my past. Rachel, my cousin, invited me to her daughter's ballet recital. I accepted, a little nervous, but when I walked into the theater, Rachel greeted me with a hug that made me feel welcome again. We sat together and watched the children dance, sharing quiet smiles and old stories between numbers. I realized then that family could take different shapes, sometimes shrinking, sometimes expanding, but always capable of change. Nancy, the coffee shop owner, invited me to a small community gathering. I met people who had lived in my neighborhood for decades. They welcomed me without question, asking nothing about my history or my pain, just eager to know the person I was becoming. I let myself enjoy those evenings, coming home with stories to tell Michael, feeling lighter with each new connection. One Sunday afternoon, Michael and I packed a picnic and drove out to the lake. We found a quiet spot beneath a stand of old maples, the breeze cool and steady. As we sat together, I told him, "I don't know if I'll ever get over what happened, but I do know I'm ready to stop living in the past." Michael squeezed my hand. "You're not alone," he said. "You never were." That evening, as the sun set over the water, I felt the first clear sense that I could build something new. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It no longer controlled me. Instead, it became part of a story that was still unfolding, one where I was choosing little by little to write the next chapter myself. As July approached and the air grew heavy with the promise of thunderstorms, I found myself looking ahead. There was no map for where I was going, but I felt ready to take each step as it came, trusting that the life I was building, though different from what I'd planned, might hold more hope than I ever expected. By midsummer, the world outside had fully come alive. The trees in my neighborhood were lush and heavy with green. Each evening, the sun lingered just a little longer in the sky. I had begun to find comfort in the new life I was building, but there were moments when I would still reach for my phone, half expecting a message from Brian or my parents, something to acknowledge the hurt, or even just a simple check-in. Those messages never came. One afternoon, after returning from work, I checked my email and found a note from Brian. The subject line was his name, nothing more. I hesitated, my hands trembling before opening it. His message was short and unadorned, but there was honesty in every line. He admitted he'd believed what he'd been told about me. He wrote that he had let Lindsay's concerns become his own without questioning them. "I let you down," he said. "I'm sorry, Catherine. I wish I could take it back." Reading his words, a mix of relief and sadness washed over me. I read the email again, letting the reality settle. The brother I grew up with was still in there, buried beneath someone else's story. After talking with Dr. Harris, I took my time in responding. I told Brian that his apology mattered, but so did the time and space I needed to heal. I didn't sugarcoat the pain his choices had caused, but I let him know that I understood what it was like to be swept along by someone else's narrative. I pressed send, then sat for a long time at the kitchen table, watching the dusk gather outside my window. Days passed, and Brian replied to thank me for reading his note and respecting my boundaries. He mentioned that things at home were difficult, that Lindsay's suspicions had now turned toward some of his closest friends. "It's like I'm seeing the pattern for the first time," he wrote. "I hope I can find my way out." His words were honest, stripped of defensiveness. I wished for his happiness, but knew I couldn't be the one to fix it for him. At work, I started to regain my footing. Carol noticed the difference, even though I hadn't said much. "You seem steadier," she remarked one afternoon, handing me a fresh stack of reports. I nodded, feeling a new strength settle inside me. I focused on rebuilding my savings, each deposit into my account, a quiet act of reclaiming what had been lost. I found myself reflecting on Dr. Harris's words during our sessions. Some relationships are transactional, and some are rooted in true care. You get to decide which ones you nurture. I began paying closer attention to the people who showed up for me without expectation. Lauren with her steady friendship, Nancy with her morning greetings, Michael with his unwavering patience. They never asked me to prove myself or to make up for lost time. They just wanted to share the present moment. Diane visited Chicago for a long weekend in August. We sat together at a downtown cafe watching the world pass by. She filled me in on family news, the cousins who missed me, the old friends who had quietly wondered about my absence at the wedding. "They're starting to ask questions," she said. "You haven't been forgotten, Catherine. Not by everyone." I felt something soften inside a knot I'd been holding, finally beginning to loosen. Later that month, Rachel sent me an invitation to her baby shower. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than she could have known. The afternoon was filled with laughter and gentle teasing old stories, resurfacing as if no time had passed. For the first time, I felt that the circle of people who cared about me was growing, even if it looked different from before. As my world expanded, my evenings with Michael became a place of quiet safety. We started planning for the future, not in sweeping terms, but in small, steady steps. We talked about vacations we might take, about dinners with friends, about what kind of life we wanted to build. Each conversation felt like a brick in the foundation of something lasting and real. Therapy gave me language for what I had been through. Dr. Harris helped me see that I had mourned not just a family, but an identity. I wasn't just Brian's sister or Richard and Joyce's daughter. I was Catherine, someone who could withstand a storm and still be standing after. She reminded me that boundaries are a form of self-respect, not punishment. "You get to choose who is close," she said. "That's your right, not a luxury." I began to recognize my own progress in quiet ways. I stopped apologizing for the distance I'd needed. I let myself say no to things that didn't feel safe. I poured energy into the people who had shown up for me in the darkest season. When I passed the old family photos in my living room, I no longer felt the urge to turn them face down. I left them out, reminders of love and history, even if they now belong to another time. One evening, as autumn pressed against the city, Michael made a simple dinner. We sat together at the table, music playing low. He reached for my hand and said, "You've changed, Catherine. You're more yourself now." I smiled, not quite believing it, but wanting to try. We toasted with iced tea to the road ahead, to the new family we were building, to the friends who had become our anchors. Looking out at the city lights that night, I realized I was living a life I hadn't planned, but one that was beginning to feel like home. The pain was still there, but it no longer led the way. In its place was a quiet courage, a readiness for whatever might come next. The first autumn leaves had started to fall, swirling down the sidewalks outside my window when I realized just how much my world had changed. The pain was still there, a quiet ache I carried through the days, but so was something sturdier. There was a steadiness to my routine, a gentleness in the way I treated myself that felt entirely new. One evening, Michael and I cooked together in our small kitchen. As I stirred a pot of soup, he watched me with that patient gaze I'd come to cherish. "You know," he said softly, "you've built something strong here, even after everything." I smiled, grateful for the home we'd made, a home that felt safe, honest, and truly ours. A week later, Diane called with an update from back home. "Your parents have started to ask about you," she said, "and your cousins Rachel and Melissa, they'd like to reconnect." Her words landed gently. The anger and longing that once pulsed through me had quieted, replaced by a careful hope. "Maybe in time," I told her. "Right now, I'm still finding my balance." Diane understood. She had always believed in letting wounds heal at their own pace. A letter arrived from Brian just before Thanksgiving. He wrote that things at home were unraveling, that Lindsay's suspicions had begun to isolate him from nearly everyone he cared about. He apologized again for believing her over me, for his silence, for the way he'd let our bond fray. "I wish I'd trusted you," he wrote. "I see it now, Catherine. I hope someday you can forgive me." His words carried weight, but I felt stronger reading them. I wrote back this time, more at peace. I thanked him for the honesty, but made clear I needed to protect the new life I'd started to build. Forgiveness. I told him would take time, but I didn't wish him harm. In the quiet days that followed, I started to let myself enjoy the world beyond old hurts. I joined Nancy's book club at the coffee shop and found myself welcomed by a circle of women who talked about stories and gardens and the best way to make pie crust. There were no hidden agendas, just genuine warmth. Lauren and I took up hiking on the weekends, moving through crisp woods and breathing in the changing season. These outings became my reminders that kindness hadn't left the world, even if it sometimes vanished from familiar places. At work, Carol gave me a new project, one that played to my strengths. I poured myself into it, discovering satisfaction in the progress I made. Small achievements built my confidence back up bit by bit. Colleagues who had once seemed distant now felt like part of a team, and the office became a place where I could contribute without carrying my pain like a secret. One night, Michael and I sat together on the balcony, mugs of tea warming our hands against the evening chill. "This year changed you," he said, "but not in the ways you feared. You're more yourself than I've ever seen." I let his words settle, realizing he was right. The old Catherine, so eager to please and belong, had made way for someone who understood her own worth. The holidays arrived quieter than the ones I'd known growing up. I was invited to Rachel's house for a small family dinner and found myself seated at a table surrounded by laughter and gentle conversation. There were no pointed questions, no tension, just the comfort of people glad to see each other. I left that evening with a warmth in my heart, knowing that family could take many forms. Michael surprised me on New Year's Eve with a simple proposal. He knelt on the rug, a nervous smile on his face, and told me he wanted to build a life with me, a life where honesty and loyalty would always come first. I said yes, tears shining in my eyes, knowing this was the beginning of something good and true. With the new year, I started seeing my story differently. The heartbreak remained, but it no longer defined me. I was surrounded by people who chose me, who valued kindness and respect above old obligations. Diane visited again in February, bringing news from home and hugs that lasted just long enough. She told me that my parents were beginning to question the stories they'd been told, that cracks were forming in the narratives that once seemed unbreakable. I listened, hopeful but cautious, knowing some wounds take longer to heal. As spring approached, I let go of old dreams and started planting new ones. My little apartment bloomed with fresh flowers, gifts from neighbors and friends. I volunteered at a local shelter, lending a hand where I could. Every week brought another small act of courage, a dinner out, a handwritten note, a moment of laughter shared with someone I trusted. Looking back, I saw the journey for what it was, a slow, sometimes painful climb from the bottom. But justice had come not as vengeance or triumph, but as the quiet restoration of my dignity. I had lost much, but I had gained the freedom to choose who would walk with me into the next chapter. As the air warmed and sunlight returned to the city, I knew my story wasn't finished. The door was open for reconciliation, but I no longer needed it to feel whole. I had become the architect of my own peace, and that was justice enough. A year passed quietly, yet it held more change than any I could remember. I saw it most on slow mornings when sunlight filtered through my apartment, and I noticed how different my world looked. My old life, once circled around family, had stretched outward, woven now with friends, small traditions, and the simple comfort of being true to myself. The ache of betrayal had softened. There were days I missed Brian, or thought of my parents, and wondered if they remembered the girl I once was. Still, I no longer reached for the past like a lifeline. I kept building my life in small, steady ways. Michael and I planned our wedding, but we took our time enjoying the rituals of choosing music and food, laughter, folding into every decision. Diane remained my anchor, always calling to check in, never pushing for more than I could give. Lauren, Rachel, and the women from Nancy's book club became my found family people who celebrated each small victory and understood the power of quiet resilience. One afternoon, a letter arrived from my parents. The envelope was thick, my mother's handwriting careful and deliberate. They apologized, not with excuses, but with the plain truth. They admitted they had believed what was easiest, not what was right, and asked if I could forgive them. I read the letter twice, hands trembling. I wrote back thanking them for the honesty, but I didn't rush to reopen the gate. I knew forgiveness would take time, and that was all right. Brian and I exchanged emails now and then. Our words were measured, tentative but kind. There was no rushing back to how things were, only the patient work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. As spring returned, I looked around my home and saw it filled with reminders of the life I had chosen. Photographs of laughter, handwritten cards from friends, Michael's jacket tossed on the chair. There were gaps, spaces left by what I'd lost, but they no longer ached the way they once did. In their place grew gratitude for what remained and what I'd found along the way. I learned that family is not just what you're given, but what you build. Sometimes life asks us to set boundaries not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I learned that it's possible to let go of the longing for what might have been and embrace the good that stands quietly in front of us. If my story finds you today, maybe you know something of loss or the long journey back to your own worth. I hope you hold tight to your dignity, to your small acts of courage, and to the people who meet you where you are. Sometimes justice is the soft return of peace. Sometimes it's the strength to begin again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of your own journey reflected here, I'd be honored if you'd share or simply carry this lesson with you. Take care of yourself and remember family can be chosen, and kindness is always worth keeping close.